My wife and I are going to be celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary. We have 2 children. Any of you work in peds? Yeah, a few? And so those of you who are in peds, you know that if you have kids, and as long as you give them water every day, and you feed them 2 or 3 times a week, they actually grow up. And so this is a little bit more recent picture of my family. My son and his wife are holding our 3 grandchildren, and they live on the central coast of California, San Luis Obispo, and they work with a faith-based organization called CREW, and serving there on the central coast. And my daughter and her husband are on the far other side. My daughter is a nurse and currently working in an OB unit at Torrance Memorial Medical Center in Southern California. And in March of 2020, if you remember that infamous month, admin walked on her telemetry floor where she was working, and they sort of waved their hands and they said, "You are the new COVID unit." And so she was taking care of COVID patients like many of you when they told her, "We ain't got no PPE for you." And finally, a few weeks later, they did get some masks, and then a little bit after that, they did get their 1N95 mask and said, "Just wear it every day forever." But she never got sick, and so we were really, really grateful to God for his provision. So what we are going to be doing today is I fully realize, and this is sort of like a session that assumes that you already know something about doing whole person care within the healthcare setting. And maybe you're familiar with the concept of taking a spiritual history. You're familiar with some of the ethical, bioethical basis that when whole person care is done, when spiritual care is done within the healthcare setting, medical research has showed that a lot of times outcomes improve. In some cases, the cost of care will go down, and almost always patient satisfaction will go up when you not only include medical care, but emotional and spiritual care. And if what I just said to you is just sort of new, and you would like to get into that a little bit more, I'm doing another session at 4 o'clock that will look specifically at that. But one of the things that I have done in terms of training healthcare professionals, we do a summer preceptorship, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but probably about a year ago, I really began to think, and we really began to think about the challenges of doing whole person care and spiritual care in the world that you live in right now because of the ever decreasing amount of time that you have with your patients. Does that sound familiar? And I don't know what your clinic is like. Hopefully it's not as bad as some of my friends that work in clinics that are owned by major corporations that are more interested in the bottom line profits. But the reality is, no matter where you are, there are increasing more things that people are wanting you to do, or EMR boxes that they're wanting you to check, or maybe seemingly relevant or irrelevant questions that they want you to ask, that including anything beyond that, even medical care, is an increasing challenge. And so we began to think about, well, how in the world do you begin to do spiritual care in that type of environment? Hence the title, So Much to Do and So Little Time to Do It. But I suspect if you're sitting here in this room right now, you have some interest or some desire to do that. And so what I did was I began to reach out to some of our preceptorship alums, men and women who are in healthcare, and most of them are, I think all of them, are physicians, and just having really honest heart-to-heart talks about, well, how I know you're doing spiritual care, but how in the world are you doing it with the challenges of the time constraints? And they began to think about it, or they began to share some stories with me and some principles that they have begun to adapt and they have begun to utilize so that somehow some form of spiritual care is present. And so what I would like to do is basically sort of share with you some of the things that they shared with me, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. I'd like to introduce you to Alicia Kadane. Alicia is a family practice physician in Houston. She has worked at Baylor. I don't think she's at Baylor anymore. She did med school at Harvard and then did family medicine residency in Houston. And Alicia is very much committed to doing spiritual care with her patients. And the clinic that she is in right now does have time constraints. But she told me that one of the things that she does, and she gave me a little bit of background, she says that at her clinic, she gets to spend about 15 minutes with established patients. That might be very similar to where you're at. She gets a 30-minute appointment with a new patient or an annual visit. And she told me that always, especially the first visit, she will take a quick spiritual history. And a spiritual history is a series of questions that are designed to find out what is a patient's coping system. Is faith a part of that coping system? How is that coping system working for them? Beginning to try to find out, are there some spiritual needs there? Does the patient recognize those needs? Does the patient want to have those needs addressed? And she told me that she can do this spiritual history in about 60 to 90 seconds, which isn't a whole lot of time. I mean, it's like maybe just a little bit less than 10% of the visit. But some of the questions that she will often ask patients is, do you have a good support system? Or tell me a little bit about your support system. Tell me about the work that you do. Or if they're a student, school. If they are retired, tell me about your past career, your past activities, or your current job or activities. She often likes to ask them about their goals. And she says when she starts asking them in the goals in general, she told me that, Bob, when I start asking them about the goals, that begins to open up what's going on with them. And I began to see some of the things that are important to them and in their life. And then I will ask them about, what is your coping system? What keeps you going when things are hard? And she will be ready to ask, if they don't mention faith, she will ask them, are you from any type of religious or spiritual background? Or is faith meaningful to you? And then the question that I really like is, well, what does that look like for you? And of course, if you've spent any time in Texas, and I realize Houston is a big metroplex and a little bit variety, but Texas is sort of, as I was talking with some Baylor students earlier, sort of like the third hole in the buckle of the Bible Belt, you know. And so I grew up in Mississippi, and in Mississippi, like, everybody says they're a Christian. But that doesn't always tell me a lot about where they're coming from. So I like that question. What does that look like for you in terms of your own personal life? And then she told me, she said, I will always ask them at some point during the visit, maybe at the end, especially based on the things that I learned from these earlier questions, would it be helpful if I pray for you? Would it be helpful if I pray for you? Not can I pray for you, not is it okay if I pray for you, but would it be helpful? Because there's a difference between the question, can I pray for you, and would it be helpful? Think about that. Well, what's the difference? Well, can I pray for you? That can often be construed as something, well, it's more about me, and it's about what I want to do. And I've seen well-meaning medical students that we're trying to work with ask patients, well, can I pray for you? And it's always amazing, it's not surprising to me when the patient will sometimes say, well, if you want to. And when I see that happen, I'll often sort of laugh, and especially if I've established some rapport with the patient. Well, that's not the question. And then they sort of get it. See, if I ask, would it be helpful if I pray for you? That's very much focused on them, right? It has nothing to do with me. So I like the way that Alicia phrases that. Now, as we go through this, some of this might be things you are already doing. Some of it you might look at and say, well, that'll never work for me. And that's okay. I'm just going to give you a big hodgepodge of things that might be useful. And you know what? If you could come away with one or two things that you could do differently on Monday morning in this area, especially with time constraints, that might be huge. So let's try to find the one or two that works for you. Alicia also does a spiritual history with kids, with her peds patients. Tell me about your living situation. What grade are you in? What are your extracurricular activities? Although she might not say extracurricular activities for a third grader. Who are your friends? Who do you hang out with? What do you want to be when you grow up? Is faith or religion or church, is that a part of who you are? And yes, Alicia will offer to pray with kids as well. Ben is actually in the back of the room. Ben did our summer preceptorship. And one of the things that when I talked to Ben, he told me that is real pivotal, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but Ben told me that every day on my way to work, I invite God into my day and I follow his lead. And I let the Holy Spirit sort of give me direction and give me insight to what's going on. And it was really interesting to me that Ben told me that when he prays this, it seems like God opens doors more. When he prays that, it seems like God opens doors more. He told me it's easier to do spiritual care when it's a part of a team. At the time, he was working in a Christian clinic in an underserved setting, like many of you. And a lot of his team members were on board with this idea of doing spiritual care. And he said if everybody's sort of tuned into that, and maybe the MA has already asked the spiritual history questions, that can really help and open things up, especially if they will put it in the chart. And so that I see that's already come up. He often said it's important to chart the things that he talks about in doing spiritual care, because a lot of times once a patient tells you something like this, they've sort of shared and opened up a part of their life. And it is, I totally understand and get it. If you see that patient 6 months later, if it were me, I'd see him that afternoon, and I'd forgotten what they told me. But if it's written down, it can actually be really good, and it can be really damaging to the patient if you know, well, I told you about such and such, and you don't remember. And you don't have to remember, but it's good to have it in the chart. Some of you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to put that in the chart. You know, I might get in trouble. One of my friends, you'll meet John Shin a little bit later. He talked about charting spiritual history issues when he was doing residency at the Mayo Clinic, and he did HEMONC at the Mayo Clinic, and then he did a stint seeing patients at the NIH in Bethesda. And all of those places, not exactly the bastion of CCHF, thinking, or the bastions, but he told me that he had rotated, I think, off of a rotation in residency, and he got this this text from the resident or the attending that came on after him, and said, Dr. Shin, I love reading your notes. I took over this patient, and I love reading what you've talked about doing spiritual care. And I'm a believer. And I've never thought about doing this before, but reading your notes, I'm doing it now. And then he said he got an email from a transcriptionist. And it's like, Dr. Shin, I love transcribing your notes and reading about how you pray with your patients and share Christ with them and all this other stuff. And I remember John telling me, he said, I had no idea that many people even read my notes. So put the stuff in the chart. Ben, and I've had other people tell me this who've trained their staff or have like-minded staff, said that he had an MA who was passionate about doing whole person care, and they would do a spiritual history, and they would make suggestions to him before he even went in the room. And that can be really helpful. A lot of times you just don't have time to ask all the questions that Alicia asked. One of the things I'm doing with the family medicine residents I'm training at Loma Linda before they go into the room, I will say, as you're reading the chart, what are one or two high-yield spiritual history questions that you might want to ask? Because you're probably not going to have time to ask 5 or 6 of them. And so they will go in the room already. And that's how you're trained already. You are trained to know the 50 questions to ask, potentially ask, or however many questions there are to ask for hypertension. But you don't go in and ask 50 questions in a 15-minute visit. But before you go in, you've looked, and you already are zeroing in on the 2 or 3 things that you need to focus on and ask them about. And so maybe think about doing that on a spiritual history level, and think about doing that before you get in the room. Said a lot of times when I do spiritual care or spiritual assessment, at one visit they come back and they expect it again. And one of my friends, Harvey Elder, infectious disease physician, says once you ask something at the first visit, no matter what it is, it becomes fair game for everything else. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. And so include a spiritual history question, and maybe it will be something, make a comment in the chart, follow up on a visit. And there are days that you get behind and you're just not going to be able to do as much. And a lot of times I can't help with every question that comes up. And you deal with that on the medical side too, and maybe it's make an additional appointment. He said other times I triage and I make time for it if it's urgent. And I'm convinced that whole person care, spiritual care is best done when it's done in the same way that medical care is done. In response to a patient need that the patient recognizes, that the patient wants to have addressed, and gives you permission to do that. Isn't that the way you sort of do medical anyway? Yeah, so spiritual care can be done in a very similar way. Bruce Sabbath, he's at MD Anderson, pulmonologist, did med school at Johns Hopkins. Bruce came out, spent a couple of summers with us at our whole person care preceptorship, and he told me, he said, I mean, it's tough sometimes, but I have to remember that Jesus got up early, he stayed late. He said, there are a lot of times I don't feel like doing spiritual care, but I pray that God would be with me and sort of refocus me. And he said, I pray that don't let me hurt a patient, guide me, help me with my patients. And he said, God seems to send patients when we are open and willing. God seems to send patients to me, especially with spiritual needs, when they're open and willing. He said a lot of times they don't need me medically, but they need me spiritually. And sometimes I have to sacrifice, and sometimes I just have to do it. And there are times I have to be willing to be inconvenience myself and make my day a little bit harder. But I remind myself that these people have a soul, and no matter if I heal them physically, they still have a soul. And I need to remember that. And the thing that I see and I focus that stands out to me about what Bruce is saying, and I'm going to come back to this, but it gets to the question, well, why are we here? Why has God put you in healthcare at this particular time in history? And why is he exposing you to the things that we're talking about right now? Bruce will almost always ask him if they're, he won't ask a lot of those other spiritual history questions, but he will ask them if faith is a part of their life or if they're from a religious background. And he said, if they're not, I need to be ready to offer to share how I handle and face hard situations. And I think it can be really valuable for you to think about different situations in your life that have been challenging personally, physically, medically, financially, relationally. And if God showed up or faith was an important part of your journey during that time, spend some time thinking about that. And spend some time thinking about how could I share in maybe 2 or 3 sentences about how God showed up when I was struggling in this relationship with my husband or my ex-spouse or my kids, or I didn't have money to pay the bills, or my mom was dying, or I got diagnosed with cancer, and be willing to say, you know, you're going through a really hard time. Would it be helpful with you? And you're going through a really hard time. And there was a time in my life that I had to deal with something similar. Would it be helpful to you if I take a few minutes to explain what was helpful to me during that time? Can you think of times that God showed up that are maybe similar? And this is a way that you can weave in faith, and it doesn't take that much time. And it can be the basis for something that can have a conversation later. So continuing on with this idea that once you get to work every day, you are moving really fast. And patients are lined up. Those who show up, I know sometimes patients don't show up for visits, but a lot of times you have days that you're just going as fast as you can go. And I want to ask the question, well, what would Jesus do in some of those situations with some of the challenges? You met Bruce earlier, the guy down at MD Anderson. You know, he's the one who talked about how he needed to recognize that sometimes Jesus got up early and sometimes he stayed late. And he told me he said, you know, just last week when I talked to him, he said, I had this patient and they needed to go over and they needed to have this procedure done and they need to have it done in this lab. And it was later in the day. And he said, I called and about them coming over, and I think they were from maybe out of town or something like that. And he said the lab told me they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it that day. And he said, you know, the reality was the people in the lab were just being lazy, and they just didn't want to do it. And they didn't want to inconvenience themselves. And so their not wanting to do this was going to inconvenience my patient. And I'm not saying that all of you should do this, or I'm not trying to lay a guilt trip on you, but I'm just telling you what Bruce did in light of this attitude, well, yeah, I know Jesus got up early and he stayed late sometimes. He said, I interrupted my day, and I wheeled my cart or whatever over, and I don't even know if his patient was in, I don't know where they were, but he went in, he himself, and he did that procedure himself so that his patient wouldn't be any more inconvenienced. And he said that patient and their family saw and recognized what I was doing, and that wasn't what I normally do, and it was like a big favor. They recognized that I was doing them a really big favor. And he said that gave me a platform and a credibility and an opportunity to be ready to speak truth into their lives. Again, I am not saying that's what you should do. I'm just sharing what Bruce told me. in terms of how do you do all this? And he said, well, sometimes it doesn't always fit. And sometimes I inconvenience myself to serve my patients. I talked about John earlier, and some of you aren't going to like this. And again, I'm not saying this is what you should do. But I asked John. John is an oncologist. He works in Southern California. Great guy, great physician, incredibly competent. I mean, you know, the CV is very impressive. And I know that doing spiritual care, that's a lot of why he's in medicine and a lot of why he went into oncology. And he and his partner, Joel Brothers, they admit that he said, yeah, in oncology, we get to pick the low-hanging spiritual fruit, you know, so to speak. So we'll give him that. But I said, so John, how are you doing spiritual care? And he said, well, I'm in an academic center, and so that means that I get 60 minutes for all my new patients, and I get 30 minutes for every returning patient. And you're thinking, oh, gosh, that's heaven. So that's a little given. But the other thing he told me, he said I pre-round on all of my patients. I spend time looking at the chart before I go in. And he said, Bob, by the time I walk in the door, I have already made all of my medical decisions. I'm up to date on the labs. I'm up to date on my past notes and my past history. And everything's decided. And I was like, wow. And he said, so I go in and I can do the medical stuff really quick, and then I can go on and move into taking a spiritual history or spiritual care or follow-up from previous conversations. I was like, wow. I said, how long does that take to pre-round, is the term he used. He said, oh, it takes me an hour and a half, 2 hours. I'm like, oh, wow. And I said, so you do that before I start? And then he said, but you know what? He said, almost always I make it up during the day. He said, I have more time for charting afterwards. He said, a lot of times visits don't go as long. He said, a lot of times there's not spiritual need, or there's not an interest, or the patient doesn't recognize a spiritual need, doesn't want me to address that. But he said it usually balances out. But being able to do that frees me up mentally and time-wise to focus. And I was just like, wow, you know, that made a lot of sense. And hence, even with the residents I work with, just in the brief time that you're looking at the chart, begin thinking, what are some, and I use this term because med students were using this a long time, high yield. Med students are always high yield. And so what's one or two high yield questions that you could potentially ask? And so you could do that. Intentionality. If there's one thing that I've noticed about the people who do spiritual care, and if you want to be one of those people, the one thing that I've noticed is intentionality. These people I've talked about and I've shared with you so far, this is a big part and the reason they go to work every day. Not that they always do it, and not that they're perfect, and not that they don't miss things, or not that they, I'm going home. And you need to go home. But there's an intentionality. This is this one thing I do, as Paul said, not these 40 things I dabble in. And I think that, like anything else, if you're intentional about, I am going to ask about the A1C, every patient, because it's such a huge issue. And you're intentional about that, and it happens. If you're not intentional, it doesn't tend to happen as much. Well, how do you maintain that intentionality? And I want you to meet Sarah Ongstad. Sarah did our summer preceptorship and met her the summer after she started med school, and I had lost track with her, and I caught up with her about a year ago, and what are you doing? And I'm in Nebraska, and I'm a vascular surgeon. You're a what? And yeah, I'm a vascular surgeon, and I take care of people out in rural Nebraska. And I have a clinic in, I think it's in Omaha. And I've worked it out with my group. I grew up on a farm, and I know a lot of my patients have to come in, and they drive like 4 or 5 hours to come in to see me. And I mean, that's a pain. And so I've worked it out with my clinic that I will actually fly out to rural Nebraska, and I've got a clinic out there, and my patients can just come see me there. And I'm like, you fly out? And it's like, yeah, I talked my group into flying me out in this little corporate jet or corporate plane. And it's like, and that goes back to, why are you there? And this intentionality. But that doesn't get to the thing about the time constraints. And she has time constraints. I mean, she's a surgeon. I mean, have you ever met a surgeon doesn't slow down? And I said, so Sarah, I said, so how do you do and maintain? And I knew she was doing it. And when I talked to her 5 minutes in, she confirmed that she was doing it. And I said, well, how do you do this on a consistent basis with the time constraints and the drive and the demand and flying out and coming back and family and so forth? And you might not like this one either. But she told me, she said, Bob, every day on my way to work, I pray this prayer. And I've started calling it the SO prayer, the Sarah Ongstad prayer. She said, Bob, I pray, God, help me to see what you want me to see, hear what you want me to hear, do what you want me to do. Now that makes sense. I've got that part, right? But then the hard part is, she says, even when it is hard, even when it hurts, even when I do not want to do it. You see that? Help me to see what you want me to see, hear what you want me to hear, do what you want me to do, even when it's hard, even when I don't want to, even when it hurts, even when it's inconvenient. And then she told me, she said, I not only pray that prayer on the way to work, I pray that prayer several times throughout my day. Now that's intentional. And what I love about Sarah is the honesty, the raw honesty that prayer represents. That sometimes it is hard, and sometimes I just don't want to do it. Or sometimes I'm scared to do it. And again, it gets back to that intentionality. She told me she said, I've got this can't touch this list. And well, what's on your can't touch this list? Well, God, my relationship with him, my marriage, my family. Those are on, but underscore with that. She also told me, even with a prayer like that, she told me, she said, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. Thus, I have to seek God first, and I realize I'm flawed, and I realize my resources are limited, yet I still want to represent you well. That's an honest prayer. That's an honest acknowledgement. And I think a lot of that is us being honest with ourselves and honest with God and honest with each other and honest in the struggle. That healthcare is hard enough, and when we start talking about adding something else on, wow. Henry Ping is a sports medicine doc in Southern California, and the thing that I really liked about what Henry told me is, he said, you know, Bob, we're in a private practice, and we can do some things, and so what we do is we limit the number of patients that we see. We limit the number of patients that we see. Now that sounds really good on one side, but you're in administration. It doesn't sound that good on the financial side, because if I see less patients, that's less money. But it goes back to, and as Henry and I were talking, it's like, well, Henry, that's sort of why you're there, is because not so much to make money, but I know you and I know your heart, and you're there to be salt and light for Jesus. And he's like, yeah, that's right. And so that is what governs what we do and how we do it. Now, I realize that some of you might not have that ability to limit. But this whole idea of why do you do what you do, showing up there. Terry McGrath, let me see. He told me, one of the things I try to keep in my head is, who do I really work for? Again, that intentionality. He said, I consistently include spiritual history questions in each new patient visit. And he said, this broadcasts and communicates to the patient that this is an open area. And I'll tell you what else it broadcasts and communicates to your patients. When you start asking spiritual history questions, they begin to look at you and, gosh, you care more about me than just my labs. Or how many times I pooped yesterday. Or, you know, why am I not taking my meds? You start asking those questions, that's what it begins to communicate to your patients. Terry told me he typically has 4 visits an hour. He said, sometimes I go longer if something comes up. He says, I can always make up the time later. I can always pick up the pace a little bit. Yes, I do spiritual care if it's needed, and it is harder when that happens. But hard things happen, and you adapt when they happen. Hard things happen medically, and you adapt. You hate it when patients says you're about to walk out the door, oh, by the way. And you shrug, and you, yes. And you've learned which things to say, okay, well, we'll talk about that next time. And then sometimes that, oh, by the way, it's like, oh, yeah, we need to deal with that now. And you adapt. I would humbly suggest that maybe spiritual care is just as important. Terry told me, let me skip some things. He told me that over time, he said spiritual care can save time. I'm like, what? Tell me more. And he said, well, as I'm doing spiritual care, as I'm asking spiritual history questions, this builds trust, and the patient's more willing to open up to me about themselves and their medical condition. He says they're more trusting to me as a clinician, and they're not as prone to push back on my suggestions. And they're not as prone to say, well, I'm not sure when I suggest something to them. And they said, if a patient doesn't, he told me, if a patient doesn't trust you, they're going to ask you a lot more follow-up questions, which takes a lot more time. So that's what he meant when he said spiritual care and spiritual history questions can save time. And then he told me, he said, at the end of each new visit, I will say, if there's ever anything going on in your life and you don't have anybody to talk to, I'm open. If you ever need prayer, anything, I'm open. Is there anything that would be helpful to you if we prayed for today? And he said, often that question begins to open up things and you begin to get to the heart of the problem. Harvey Elder, infectious disease physician, was seeing a patient one day and about to see a patient. The nurse was in the room. Nurse came out and it was like, he's not taking his meds. HIV patient. I told him he has to take his meds. He's not taking his meds. He's going to get in trouble if he doesn't take his meds. I told him all that. And so Dr. Elder goes in and, oh, I hear you met my nurse. And here, you're not taking your med? No. Nurse wasn't happy. Yeah. And rather than give that patient the long white coat version of the lecture, he began asking him spiritual history questions. And what he found out in asking those questions, that this guy just a few days earlier had signed over, forced to sign over his parental rights, and he lost his kids. And he told Dr. Elder, he said, now every night I sit alone at a table with 3 empty chairs. Now, is any lecture going to cause him to start taking his meds? No. You see how that might save time later? A couple of resources if you want to read about this. There's a really great book that's entitled Gray Matter. Neurosurgeon discovers the power of prayer one patient at a time. It's written by a friend of mine, David Levy, who lives in San Diego. And this is a story about David's, not only his own personal family story and his faith story. David's father was Jewish. His mom was Christian, but also his story of beginning to do whole person care in his own surgical practice. And there's enough technical information in there to keep you engaged professionally, but I recommend that book. There's another book entitled Hostility to Hospitality, written by a couple. Tracy Balboni is up at Harvard. Her husband Michael has done a number of things at Harvard and in the Boston community. And Tracy actually had a really good study that was published in JAMA about 2 years ago, entitled the importance of doing spiritual care in seriously ill patients. I think that was June of 2022, JAMA. Really good study if you want to look at some of the statistics behind this. Before we open it up to Q&A, any students in the room? No? A few? Anybody know any healthcare students? Yeah? Okay. So if you know healthcare students and you think they might be interested in learning how to do spiritual care, we do a preceptorship in Southern California, the whole person care preceptorship. I got some flyers up front. This is probably the best thing that we do. Everybody I talked about earlier were, when they were in their training, did our whole person care preceptorship and are now practicing doing spiritual care in a really great way. So our website's right there. I've got a lot of other slides on that I'm not going to go through right now. But what questions or comments or criticism or pushback do you have?
None of that, but just more just physician students?
Yes. Medical, dental, PA, PT, OT, nursing, nurse prac. Students have to either be enrolled in or officially accepted to apply. We've had a lot of nursing students come the summer after they graduated. We had some nursing students take the NCLEX while they're there. I don't necessarily recommend it. It went well for some and not so well for one of them. But it is really cool because that whole day you've got like 25 people praying for you and you know, that you're going to go home and have dinner with that night. So, I'm sorry? Dietitian, yeah. Basically, pharmacy, basically anybody that's going to have patient contact. Yeah. Well, I think we are over. I will be around for a few minutes if anybody wants to talk. If you want any information about our preceptorship, there are flyers right here. If you want my slides, if you will, I can give you my card or you give me your email or whatever, I can get those to you. So thanks for your time. Enjoy your time here.